The old house stood quietly at the end of Ocean Avenue, its dark windows reflecting the gray sky above. Weathered by decades of storms, secrets, and death, it waited patiently, like a living entity holding its breath. The neighbors called it cursed. The locals, hardened by generations of small-town superstitions, avoided walking past it, whispering its name only in hushed tones when darkness fell. Yet, for David and Emily Carter, the house was a chance. A new beginning they desperately craved. They pulled up in a battered silver truck, the tires crackling against the gravel driveway. David sat behind the wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, staring at the house. The familiar sinking feeling gnawed at his stomach. It was supposed to be a dream, a house big enough for their little family, for Ethan to grow up free, running through wide halls and sprawling lawns. The price had been unbelievably low, almost suspiciously so, but David ignored the warning bells that had clanged in the back of his mind when they signed the deed. Emily reached over, touching his hand gently. "We're here," she whispered, her voice hopeful, though her eyes betrayed the nervousness she tried to hide. "It's ours now." David forced a smile and turned to glance at their 6-year-old son, Ethan, who sat quietly in the back seat, his large blue eyes staring at the looming house. Ethan didn't speak. He simply stared as if he understood something neither of them did. "Come on, buddy. Time to see your new home," David called, his voice too cheerful to sound natural. Ethan didn't respond. He pushed the car door open and stepped out slowly, his little hand clutching the frayed strap of his backpack. The air smelled of damp earth and something else. Something metallic, like the sharp tang of rusted iron or dried blood. Emily took a deep breath, stepping out and gazing up at the windows. "It's bigger than I remembered," she murmured. The house was massive, 3 stories tall, with a distinctive gambrel roof that gave it the appearance of a brooding face. 2 quarter-moon windows stared down like watchful eyes. The paint had peeled away in large strips, exposing the warped wood beneath. Weeds choked the front yard, and a dead tree stood gnarled near the front porch. The real estate agent's voice echoed in Emily's mind. "Yes, it's the Amityville house. The one from the news. But that was a long time ago. Time heals, and places like this deserve a second chance. Don't you think?" She hadn't asked any more questions. They couldn't afford to be picky. David grabbed the first of the boxes and trudged up the creaking wooden steps. Each groan of the wood felt like a warning. Emily followed with Ethan in tow. The boy kept glancing over his shoulder at the empty street, as though expecting someone, or something, to be watching. The door swung open easily, revealing the house's grand yet decaying interior. A sweeping staircase rose in the center of the hall, flanked by dusty chandeliers that barely swayed despite the heavy air. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the scent of mildew was overpowering. Emily forced a smile. "See? It just needs a little love." David gave a short laugh. "And about 50 gallons of paint." They unloaded boxes in silence, each of them acutely aware of how the house seemed to swallow sound. Even their footsteps felt muffled, like the walls were listening. Hours passed, the afternoon sun sliding slowly down the sky. By evening, the house seemed darker than it should have been, shadows pooling in corners where no light could reach. That night, they sat together on the worn leather couch left behind by the previous owners. The furniture was old, but they couldn't afford new yet. Emily lit a single candle, the tiny flame flickering wildly as if struggling to stay alive. "To new beginnings," David toasted weakly, raising a glass of cheap wine. "To us," Emily whispered. Ethan sat apart, staring at the staircase. "She's upstairs," he said suddenly, his voice flat. David and Emily exchanged glances. "Who, honey?" Emily asked gently. "The girl. She's wearing white. She says her name is Jody." A chill ran down Emily's spine. She forced a laugh. "An imaginary friend already, huh?" Ethan didn't laugh. He simply smiled thinly and kept staring at the shadows dancing on the stairs. That night, the dreams began. David found himself walking through the house, only it wasn't the house he knew. Blood stained the walls, and a man's voice screamed through the halls. "They made me do it! over and over until David awoke gasping, his shirt soaked with sweat. Emily dreamed of water, deep and dark, pulling her down. Faces appeared beneath the surface, pale, hollow-eyed children reaching for her. She woke with a scream, finding her throat raw and her hands clenched so tightly her nails had broken the skin. Ethan slept peacefully, a faint smile on his lips. The days blurred together. Cold spots appeared throughout the house. No matter how high they turned the thermostat, some rooms remained ice-cold. Doors creaked open by themselves, and footsteps echoed on the stairs when no one was there. Emily tried to brush it off. Old houses make noise, she told herself, but deep down she knew better. One afternoon, as Emily unpacked the last of the kitchen boxes, Ethan walked in, his face pale. "Jody says you should go see the basement," he whispered. Emily froze. "What?" "She says it's where the bad thing happened." Heart pounding, Emily grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the basement door. The hinges screamed in protest as she forced it open. A wave of cold air hit her, smelling of rot and earth. Slowly, she descended the stairs. The basement was dark, the single bulb flickering weakly. She swept the light across the concrete floor until she spotted it. A patch of the wall that looked wrong. The bricks didn't match. Kneeling, Emily ran her fingers across the surface, feeling the outline of a doorway. A hidden room. David was furious when she told him, but together they broke through the false wall. What lay beyond made Emily gag. The room was small, no larger than a closet, painted entirely red. Symbols she couldn't understand covered the walls, drawn in something dark and dried. She could almost hear whispers rising from the walls themselves. They sealed it up quickly, agreeing never to tell Ethan. But it was too late. The house had awakened. At night, Emily heard the whispers, soft at first, then louder until they screamed. David began waking with scratches on his arms and back, as though clawed by unseen hands. Ethan became distant, often staring at the corner of the room, nodding as if listening to someone. It was then that Emily decided to investigate the house's past. Late at night, while David and Ethan slept, she sat hunched over her laptop, digging through old news articles. The story was worse than she remembered. Ronald DeFeo Jr. had murdered his entire family. Father, mother, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters. In their beds. Execution style. Cold, calculated. And when asked why, he simply said, "The voices made me do it." Emily's hands trembled as she read the details. Shotguns, blood, fear, death. The house, she realized, wasn't just haunted by ghosts. It was soaked in violence, feeding off it. And now it had new prey. The next morning, Emily woke with a pounding headache, her dreams of the night before still clawing at her consciousness. She rolled over to see David sitting upright in bed, staring blankly at the far wall. His eyes were bloodshot, dark circles carved deep beneath them. "You okay?" she asked, voice raspy. David blinked slowly. "I didn't sleep. Another nightmare?" He nodded slowly. "I heard voices last night. They were calling my name, Em. I swear to God. They were right there, whispering." Emily shivered, forcing herself to smile. "Maybe the stress. It's been a long week." David shook his head. "No, it wasn't just me. The voices, they knew things about me, things I've never told anyone. Regrets, mistakes, things from when I was a kid." Emily's throat tightened. She knew exactly what he meant. Her own dreams had been vivid, too real. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. But she couldn't say it. She had to stay strong, at least for Ethan. Speaking of which, where was Ethan? Emily hurried downstairs, calling for him. "Ethan? Baby, where are you?" No response. Panic rising. She checked the living room, the kitchen, the front yard, nothing. Then she heard a giggle, faint but clear, coming from upstairs. She bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, following the sound until she reached the small guest bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, creaking gently. Inside, Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, talking quietly to someone only he could see. Emily froze in the doorway, her breath catching. Ethan? Ethan turned his head slowly, smiling. Mommy, this is Jody. She says she lived here before. Emily's mouth went dry. Sweetie, there's no one there. She's shy. She only shows herself to me. She says you're not ready yet. Ethan, it's time for breakfast, Emily managed, trying to keep her voice steady. Ethan frowned. Jody says I don't have to listen to you. Emily's temper flared, but fear crushed it down. Ethan, now. Reluctantly, the boy stood and followed her. But as he passed, he whispered under his breath, You made her mad, Mommy. Emily shivered, feeling as though cold fingers had brushed her neck. The days grew heavier, the air inside the house thick with unseen weight. David began to change, growing quiet, irritable. He spent hours just staring out the window, watching the street with dead eyes. At night, the sounds grew worse. Scratching in the walls, footsteps pacing the hallway, moaning that rose and fell like the ocean tide. Emily stopped sleeping altogether. Each time she closed her eyes, the dreams came, visions of blood running down the walls, of Ethan floating lifelessly in the bathtub, his eyes wide and accusing. One evening, David snapped. Emily found him in the kitchen, staring at the butcher's knife in his hand, his knuckles white. They said it's the only way, he whispered. Emily's heart pounded. What? What are you talking about? His eyes snapped up, wild and full of something she couldn't recognize. They said if I do it, if I finish it, we'll be free. Emily grabbed his wrist, forcing him to drop the knife. David, listen to me. There's no they. It's this house. It's in our heads. We need to leave. David collapsed against her, sobbing. I can't stop hearing them. Emily held him tight, tears streaming down her face. She knew then that it wasn't just the house. It was inside them now. The next day, desperate for answers, Emily drove to the local library. She pored over old newspaper clippings, police reports, everything she could find about the DeFeo murders and the Lutz family who'd lived thereafter. The stories were horrific. Voices, cold spots, swarms of flies, glowing red eyes outside the windows. A priest who'd tried to bless the house and was driven away violently. The Lutz family had lasted only 28 days. Emily counted the days since they'd moved in 25. Her hands trembled as she read the final line of the article. The Lutz family fled in the middle of the night, leaving all their belongings behind. To this day, no one knows what truly happened inside 112 Ocean Avenue. Emily looked up, heart racing. She knew what happened. It was happening again. That night, she confronted David. We have to go. Now. David shook his head, defeated. We can't afford to leave, Em. Where would we go? We put everything into this place. I don't care. I'll beg. I'll steal, whatever it takes. If we stay, one of us is going to die. I can feel it. David stared at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Tomorrow. We'll leave tomorrow. But the house had other plans. At midnight, Emily awoke to the sound of Ethan screaming. She raced to his room, her heart nearly exploding in her chest. She found him hovering above his bed, his small body convulsing, his mouth open in a silent scream. Around him, the air shimmered, distorted. Dark figures circled him, whispering in a language Emily couldn't understand. She lunged forward, grabbing him, pulling him down with all her strength. As she did, the figures vanished, leaving only cold silence. Ethan collapsed in her arms, sobbing. She said, Daddy's going to kill us. Jody said it's the only way. Emily held him tight, rocking him. No, baby. No one's going to hurt you. I swear. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure it was true. Downstairs, David sat at the kitchen table, staring at the shotgun he'd found in the attic. Left behind, perhaps, by DeFeo himself. The voices were back, louder than ever. Do it. End it. Free them. Free yourself. His hands trembled as he picked up the gun. Emily sensed it. Somehow she knew. She raced downstairs just in time to see David raise the shotgun to his mouth. No! she screamed, throwing herself at him. They struggled, the gun clattering to the floor. David sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her. I can't stop it. It's inside me, Em. It's inside all of us. Emily held him, tears streaming down her face. We have to go. Now. I don't care if it's midnight. We leave. David nodded weakly. They packed what they could in minutes, grabbing only what mattered. Ethan clung to Emily, pale and silent. As they reached the door, a voice echoed through the house. Low, guttural, full of rage. You can't leave. You belong to me. The door slammed shut, the locks clicking on their own. David cursed, throwing his weight against the door. It didn't budge. Windows slammed shut, the house groaning like a living thing. Emily screamed, praying, begging, pleading, and then silence. The door swung open. Without looking back, they ran into the night, into the unknown, leaving behind everything, including the house that watched them go, its windows glowing faintly red in the darkness. They never returned. And yet, the locals whispered that sometimes, late at night, you could see a little boy staring from the attic window of 112 Ocean Avenue, his pale face pressed against the glass. Waiting. The Amityville curse whispers in the walls. The night after they tried to flee, the whispers began. Emily lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. She hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the house breathing. She could swear it shifted around them, groaning beneath their weight as if resenting their presence. David, beside her, twitched in his sleep, mumbling under his breath. Ethan was silent, too silent. Since that night, he hadn't spoken a word, not even to his imaginary friend Jody. Emily blinked up at the ceiling when she first heard it. A soft voice, barely audible, faint as a breath. Emily? It was so gentle, so quiet, she thought she imagined it. Emily? The voice came again, sweet, almost loving. Emily bolted upright. David? She whispered, glancing at her husband. But David was asleep, brow furrowed in a nightmare. She held her breath, listening. Emily? Come down. The voice coaxed from somewhere inside the walls, soft as silk. Her skin prickled. There was no one else in the house. No one but her family. Heart pounding. She threw off the covers and tiptoed into the hallway. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her weight. Shadows danced along the walls, stretching into impossible shapes. Every window reflected her pale face, but in some, she could swear there were two faces staring back. She shook her head. It's the house messing with me. Just the house. Yet the voice continued, guiding her step by step, luring her toward the basement. Come down, Emily. We're waiting. Something primal screamed inside her to turn back. But she couldn't. Her legs carried her forward against her will. Down the stairs, into the suffocating darkness. The basement door creaked open, and the air hit her like a wave. Damp, icy, reeking of mildew and something worse. She flicked the light switch. Nothing. The bulb had died. Of course it had. Hello? She whispered, hugging herself. A low laugh echoed from the shadows. Then silence. Trembling, she backed away, slamming the door shut. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. She sat by Ethan's bedside, watching his tiny chest rise and fall. By morning, the voice was gone, but it returned the next night, and the next, and every night after, growing louder, more demanding. Meanwhile, David was losing his grip. The dreams came nightly now. He would wake choking, gasping for breath, as if he were drowning. The dreams always started the same, standing waist-deep in thick, dark water. At first, he thought it was a lake, but then the coppery smell hit him. Blood. He would struggle to move, but the water dragged him down. Bodies floated past. Emily, Ethan, faces pale and still. Then, from the distance, a man would emerge, Ronald DeFeo. His face twisted in a grin, the shotgun resting casually on his shoulder. You'll finish what I started, the man would say, eyes gleaming with cruel delight. It's in your blood now. David would scream, but no sound ever came. just the endless sound of water rushing in, drowning him. When he woke, the sheets were soaked in sweat, his throat raw. Emily tried to comfort him, but what could she say? How could she explain that she was hearing voices in the walls? That something unseen was calling her name like a lover? Ethan grew worse. He barely ate, barely slept. He would sit in corners, talking to Jody, or something pretending to be Jody. His once bright eyes turned dull, shadowed by dark circles. Jody says we should stay, he whispered one morning as Emily tried to spoon oatmeal into his mouth. Why, sweetheart? She asked softly. She says the house is lonely. She says we belong here now. Emily felt cold sweat trickle down her back. Ethan, there's no Jody. She's just pretend. Ethan's eyes snapped to hers, suddenly furious. She's real. She's more real than you. He stormed off, leaving Emily shaking. Desperate, Emily turned to the church. She found Father Andrews, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. She told him everything, leaving out no detail. The priest listened silently, nodding slowly. I know the house, he finally said. Everyone here does. But I'll come. I'll do what I can. The next morning, Father Andrews arrived, his hands clutching his Bible so tightly his knuckles were white. Emily led him inside, the air growing colder with each step they took. It feels wrong, he murmured. David didn't join them. He sat by the window, staring at nothing. Father Andrews sprinkled holy water as he moved, murmuring prayers. For a moment, it felt like the air grew lighter. Emily dared to hope. Then the flies came, hundreds of them pouring from the walls, the ceiling, the very floorboards. Black clouds of them, buzzing furiously. They swarmed the priest, covering his face, crawling into his ears, his mouth. Father Andrews screamed, dropping the crucifix. The metal burned his hand, smoke rising from his flesh. Emily screamed too, grabbing Ethan and running. David didn't move. Father Andrews staggered to the door, collapsing on the front lawn, gasping for air. I can't, he wheezed. I can't help you. It's too strong. Emily knelt beside him, sobbing. Please, please don't leave us. But the priest's eyes were wide with terror. Leave this place. Leave now. If you stay, it will take you all. He left that day and never returned. That night, the house celebrated. The whispers turned into voices. Loud, mocking, cruel. You thought a priest could save you? They laughed. No one can help you. You are ours. Emily sat on the floor, rocking Ethan, who stared blankly at the wall. Mommy, he whispered. Jody says Daddy's going to hurt us. Emily sobbed. No, baby. No, he won't. She says, he has to. David changed after the priest left. He moved through the house like a ghost, silent, empty. Emily found him sitting in the red room one night, staring at the wall. David, she whispered. They're right, he murmured. There's no escape. Yes, there is. We just have to leave. David shook his head. Even if we run, it'll follow us. It's inside us now. Emily touched his face. Please, fight it. For Ethan. David's eyes filled with tears. I don't know if I can. The days became a blur of darkness and fear. The house groaned and creaked, its walls whispering secrets Emily couldn't understand. Shadows moved in the corners of her eyes. Sometimes, she swore she saw figures standing just out of reach. Ethan stopped speaking altogether. David sharpened knives in the kitchen, his eyes hollow. And Emily began to hear the voice in her own mind. Kill them, it whispered. End their suffering. End yours. She fought it, biting her lip until she tasted blood. But the voice was always there, always waiting. One night, as the rain lashed against the windows, Emily sat alone in the living room. The TV flickered, but no sound came. She stared at the blank screen until she saw it, her reflection. But it wasn't her. The reflection smiled. She didn't. She screamed, hurling the remote through the screen. Glass shattered. The reflection laughed. David didn't come. Ethan didn't stir. She was alone. The house fed on them, draining them. Emily knew they were dying slowly, piece by piece. She tried to call for help, but the phones didn't work. The lines were dead. The cell phones refused to connect. They were cut off, and the house whispered, "You belong to me now." One night, as the rain lashed against the windows, Emily sat alone in the living room. The TV flickered, but no sound came. She stared at the blank screen until she saw it, her reflection. But it wasn't her. The reflection smiled. She didn't. She screamed, hurling the remote through the screen. Glass shattered. The reflection laughed. David didn't come. Ethan didn't stir. She was alone. The house fed on them, draining them. Emily knew they were dying slowly, piece by piece. She tried to call for help, but the phones didn't work. The lines were dead. The cell phones refused to connect. They were cut off. The Amityville curse, the Red Room. The house had grown quieter, but Emily knew better. Silence in this place wasn't peace. It was patience. It was the house biding its time, waiting for them to fall further. They had barely spoken since Father Andrews fled. The whispers had grown softer but never truly left. The air was thick, heavy with unsaid words and unseen things. It was during one of those suffocating afternoons that David stumbled upon it. They had been cleaning the basement or trying to, ignoring the stench of mildew and death that clung to the walls. Boxes rotted where they sat, damp with age. Emily picked through old tools, while David pushed aside a shelf that seemed strangely out of place. It was then that he felt the draft. Get over here," he called, his voice thin. Emily wiped sweat from her brow and crossed the room. "What?" David ran his fingers along the concrete wall behind the shelf. "Feel that?" She placed her hand where he pointed. A faint breeze kissed her skin, too cold for the stagnant basement air. "There's something behind this," David muttered. Without another word, he grabbed a crowbar and pried at the bricks. They crumbled too easily, almost as if they'd been waiting for this moment. It took minutes to expose the doorway. A low, fetid breath seemed to exhale from the darkness beyond. They stood there, staring at the pitch-black hole in their basement wall. A hidden room, one that hadn't appeared on any blueprints or floor plans. "We shouldn't," Emily whispered, every instinct screaming. But they did. David found an old flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the darkness as they stepped inside. The room was small, almost claustrophobic. And red. Not painted, no, it was something worse. The very walls seemed soaked in crimson, bleeding from within. Symbols covered every inch of the surface. Ancient, foul things that twisted Emily's stomach to look at. Circles within circles, jagged lines, shapes that seemed to move if stared at too long. It's a summoning room," David choked. "A fucking altar." Emily couldn't speak. Her mouth was dry, her body frozen. In the center of the room, something rested on the ground. A small, rusted trapdoor. David bent, reaching for it, but Emily yanked him back. "No," she gasped. "Don't touch it." David looked at her, sweat beading on his forehead. "What the hell is this, Em?" But Emily couldn't answer. The walls seemed to pulse, and the air grew thick, suffocating. They fled, stumbling out of the room and sealing it shut. Or so they thought. That night, Emily dreamed of the room. She stood within it, naked and cold, the symbols glowing faintly around her. A voice called her name, sweet and low, promising things she dared not imagine. When she woke, she was already halfway down the stairs, barefoot and trembling. The Red Room called to her. She visited it every night after that. David didn't know. Ethan was silent, always watching, his wide eyes reflecting things he should never see. The first few nights, Emily simply stood at the threshold, breathing in the rot and decay. Then she stepped inside, sitting cross-legged on the cold stone floor. The whispers returned, but they didn't frighten her now. They comforted her, praised her, told her secrets about the house, about David, about Ethan. She laughed sometimes, alone in the darkness, as the house wrapped its tendrils around her soul. It was Ethan who finally spoke. "She's down there, Daddy," Jody says Mommy doesn't love us anymore. David's hands trembled as he smoked his 5th cigarette of the morning. Don't say that, buddy. Mommy's just... She's tired. Ethan shook his head. She's with them now. David didn't know what to do. He'd seen the change in Emily. Her eyes were darker, her smile too wide. She smelled of the basement. Desperate, he did the unthinkable. He called in help. Paranormal investigators, 2 men from the city, skeptics turned believers. They arrived on a gray morning, armed with cameras, EVP recorders, and hollow bravado. This is the place, huh? One of them joked. The big bad house. David could barely look at them. You don't know what you're walking into. They laughed. They always laughed. They set up their equipment, running wires and sensors through the house. Emily watched from the stairs, her lips curled in a smirk. Won't help, she whispered. That night, the investigators descended into the basement. David refused to follow. He sat in the kitchen, gripping a beer like a lifeline, listening to the faint sound of their voices below. Then the screaming started. It wasn't human. The sound that rose from the basement was raw, primal. A sound of pure terror. David jumped to his feet as one of the men burst from the basement, eyes wide, face pale. She's down there, he gasped. Something's waiting. The other never came back up. David stared. What do you mean? But the man was gone, running into the night, abandoning his friend. David didn't dare go down. Hours passed. No sound. No movement. Finally, the house groaned, and the basement door creaked open on its own. The second investigator stood there, his face blank, eyes black as coal. We're all part of it now, he whispered. Then he vanished. Emily smiled wider after that. She slept during the day, wandered at night. David began waking in strange places. The kitchen, the front yard, the hallway, clutching the old rifle he'd found in the attic. It was unloaded, but it didn't matter. Each night he relived the same dream, walking through the house, hunting his family. The rifle cold in his hands, the whispers guiding him. Finish it. Free them. Free yourself. Ethan stopped speaking entirely. He drew pictures, black crayon on torn paper. Pictures of the house burning, of his father holding the rifle, of his mother bleeding from her eyes. David knew what was coming. The house was almost ready, and so was he. The days became endless shadows. The sunlight, when it touched the house, seemed weaker, as if the very air rejected the idea of light. David felt it too, the slow pull of the red room calling him, twisting his dreams until the line between waking and sleep blurred. Emily was no longer the woman he married. She'd grown pale, her once bright eyes now hollow, ringed with bruises from sleepless nights. Her lips cracked from muttering to herself, sometimes laughing softly, as if sharing private jokes with the walls. David would catch her staring at nothing for hours, her hand tracing invisible patterns in the air. When he tried to speak to her, she wouldn't respond, or worse, she'd smile, a thin, cruel curl of the lips that made his stomach turn. The nights were worse. David woke up standing, sometimes at the foot of Ethan's bed, the unloaded rifle gripped tightly in his hands, Ethan staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. Other times, he found himself outside in the dead garden, the wind howling through the skeletal trees, his bare feet raw from walking over thorns and frozen dirt. The rifle was always there, heavy, familiar, whispering, "They're suffering." The voice in his head hissed, "End it." Emily stopped sleeping entirely. She vanished into the basement for hours, sometimes days. David couldn't bring himself to follow. The few times he tried, the steps grew longer, the darkness deeper, the stench unbearable. He would stop halfway down, trembling, heart racing, knowing if he took one more step, he'd never come back. From upstairs, he'd hear her voice, soft, singing lullabies she hadn't sung since Ethan was a baby. But there was another voice too, deeper, older, whispering alongside her. One evening, David found Ethan sitting on the couch, holding one of the paranormal investigators' cameras. It was covered in dust, the battery long dead. "Where did you get that?" David asked, heart pounding. Ethan didn't answer. He just pointed toward the basement door. I saw them, Daddy. They're still here. David snatched the camera away, furious. Don't ever go down there. You hear me? Never. Ethan flinched but nodded. David examined the camera. Against his better judgment, he found the charger buried in the investigators' abandoned equipment and plugged it in. When the screen flickered to life, his blood ran cold. There was footage, hours of it, filmed after the investigators disappeared. Emily, sitting in the red room, her eyes glazed, her lips moving. Around her, the symbols glowed faintly. Shadows moved in the corners, circling her like vultures. Then, a voice, deep, inhuman. Bring the boy. The blood seals the bond. David smashed the camera, screaming. That night, the house attacked. It began with the walls bleeding. Thick, black sludge oozed from every crack, pooling on the floor. The windows shattered inward, glass slicing David's arms and face. The lights exploded one by one, plunging them into darkness. Emily appeared at the top of the stairs, her face blank, her eyes solid black. It's time, she whispered. He's waiting. David grabbed Ethan, running. But the front door wouldn't open. No matter how hard he pulled, no matter how much he screamed, the house laughed. A deep, rumbling sound that shook the very floorboards. David turned, rifle raised, but Emily didn't flinch. You'll do it, she smiled. It's what he wants. What you want. The first snow had fallen over Amityville. Thick and wet, it clung to the windows of the house like ghostly hands, as if the house itself had exhaled a sigh of frost. From the outside, the house on 112 Ocean Avenue looked peaceful, almost serene. But inside, darkness had rooted deep within its walls, whispering lullabies only the damned could understand. Ethan Carter hadn't slept in 2 nights. His hands trembled as he sat at the edge of the bed, watching the window. The trees swayed gently, but his eyes weren't on the wind. They were fixed on the faint reflection staring back at him. His own face, and behind it, barely visible, the shape of a man with hollow eyes. Emily, his wife, had grown pale, withdrawn. Her once lively demeanor now cracked by paranoia. Their son, David, no longer laughed. He no longer spoke. And in the still hours of the night, Ethan often found his daughter Sarah staring into the hallway, eyes wide, whispering to someone who wasn't there. But it wasn't until the dead returned that the Carters truly began to understand the evil they had stirred. Started with the smell, rotting meat, sulfur, and something metallic. It wafted through the vents despite the house being scrubbed clean. Then came the cold spots, bone-chilling pockets of air that followed them through rooms like silent watchers. But none of it compared to what happened the night Ethan saw the DeFeo family for the first time. He had gone down to the basement, chasing the sound of a dripping faucet. But there was no leak, only silence, and then voices, children laughing, a woman weeping. The sounds grew louder, nearer, and then they appeared, one by one, transparent but unmistakably human. Ronald Sr., Louise, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew, the family that had been gunned down in their sleep nearly 5 decades ago. Their eyes were hollow. They didn't speak. They simply stood in the dark, mouths open, pointing toward the stairs. Get out, came a voice, not spoken aloud, but pressed into Ethan's mind like a hot iron. He ran. He didn't tell Emily. He didn't tell anyone. But the dead didn't stop visiting. That same night, Sarah woke screaming, claiming that a girl in white had come into her room and sat on her bed, whispering stories about what happened in the red room. Emily brushed it off as a nightmare, until she walked into Sarah's room and saw the sheets soaked with blood. There were no wounds on Sarah, no source for the blood. The house was no longer haunted. It was possessed. In the backyard, the snow melted into slush, revealing horrors beneath. Dead birds with broken wings, squirrels torn apart. Then the larger animals, dogs, cats, their bodies mutilated, symbols carved into their skin with unnatural precision. Ethan buried them in silence, digging through frozen ground with blistered hands. But nothing prepared him for what he found beneath the swing set. As he dug to reposition one of the posts, the shovel struck something solid. Wood. A box. Inside, an old, rotted diary wrapped in faded lace. The handwriting was childlike. Jody. She said I could play forever. Jody. That name had returned, again and again. Sarah whispered it in her sleep. Emily muttered it while brushing her hair. Even David, silent for weeks, had suddenly whispered, Jody says we're not supposed to leave. Ethan burned the diary. But that night, the girl came to him. He saw her standing in the hallway. White dress, dark hair, face pale and smiling. She beckoned. He followed, unable to stop himself. Down the stairs, through the living room, into the basement. There she changed. The face twisted. The mouth widened far beyond human limits, filled with blackness and teeth. Her voice dropped several octaves as she whispered, I was never a girl. I was hunger. Jody was not a ghost. She was a demon. She showed Ethan what had happened to the DeFeo family. Not just the murders, but the ritual beneath. The blood drawn on the walls. The words whispered in Latin. The pact made in desperation. You live here now, Jody hissed. So do I. When Ethan awoke, he was outside, half buried in snow, covered in scratches. Sarah sat on the porch swing, smiling. She says you're special, she told him. Inside, Emily's condition worsened. She locked herself in the bathroom for hours, arguing with voices no one else could hear. She stopped eating. Her eyes became sunken, her skin gray. I hear them at night, she whispered to Ethan one morning. They tell me to hurt him. Hurt who? David. They say he's the key, that he has the light. Ethan panicked. He tried to get help. He drove into town to call a priest. But Father Mallory had already heard the stories. The locals still feared the house. They won't let me in, the priest said, trembling. That house. It belongs to something far older than me. Desperate, Ethan reached out to an old friend, Mara, a spiritualist and paranormal researcher. She came with equipment, candles, and knowledge. But as soon as she stepped inside, the house reacted. The lights shattered, the walls bled, and in the basement, Jody screamed. Mara knew immediately, this isn't just a haunting, this is an anchor. Something evil was brought here, and something is keeping it in place. They held a seance. The spirits came, the DeFeos, other victims, even the previous tenants who had vanished. You must leave, the spirits pleaded. You must break the bond. But the house fought back. Doors slammed shut. Sarah levitated off the floor. Emily collapsed in seizures. David screamed, She's in me, before vomiting black bile. Jody laughed through the walls. Mara discovered the truth in the foundation. The house had been built over a desecrated Lenape burial ground. The land was cursed, but it wasn't the only source of power. In the basement, hidden beneath the floorboards, they found it. A stone altar old as time, etched with runes that burned when touched. It's a gateway, Mara whispered. This is where it comes through. The final night began with fire, a spontaneous combustion in the attic. The flames didn't spread, but the smoke brought visions, flashes of all the deaths that had occurred in the house. The DeFeos, the pets, the missing tenants, and something more, something ancient, reptilian, crawling between worlds. Emily tried to kill David that night. Knife in hand, she entered his room, eyes black, whispering Jody's name. Ethan tackled her just in time. Mara began the ritual Latin chants, salt, sacred ash. The house screamed. The floor cracked. The walls wept blood. The ceiling turned black with crawling insects. Jody appeared, no longer hiding. Her true form a towering, skeletal creature with wings of smoke and eyes like burning coals. You cannot undo the pact, she roared. But David stepped forward. He raised his hand, glowing faintly. Light poured from his palm. Jody shrieked. He's a vessel, Mara whispered. The child, he's protected. David touched the altar. Cracked. Light surged upward like a pillar of fire. The house began to collapse. Ethan grabbed his children. Emily, now sobbing, followed blindly. They ran as the walls folded inward, the roof caving. Jody's scream echoed into the night. They made it outside just as the house imploded, not with an explosion, but as if it had been swallowed from within, leaving nothing but ash and silence. The Carters never spoke of it again. They moved across the country, changed their names, tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah still whispers to herself. And David stares into the shadows, eyes wide. The silence in the house had changed. It was no longer the silence of peace, of a home sleeping under the snow. It had become something more sinister, tense, stretched, like the moment before a scream. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the radiators, carried a presence that no longer bothered to hide. David Carter sat in his room, alone, staring at his hands. They were covered in blood. It wasn't fresh, but dark and dried, the smell sharp and metallic, almost suffocating. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his mind clawed desperately for a memory, any memory of what had happened. There was none, just blackness, a void, a moment lost. He heard whispers, not outside, not in the hallway or beyond the windows. Inside him, behind his ears, beneath his skin. "You opened the door," the voice murmured. "Now you belong to us." The words were cold, slithering like serpents around his spine. Downstairs, Ethan and Emily argued again. Ethan's voice was tight with desperation. Emily's, erratic, like a song that couldn't find its melody. "I saw him," she hissed. "He wasn't our son last night." His eyes, Ethan, they were black, hollow. "He's just sick," Ethan replied. "He needs help, we need help." But Emily wasn't listening. She was staring past him, eyes glazed, whispering something in a language Ethan didn't understand. He gripped her shoulders. "Emily, what's happening to you?" She blinked once, slowly, then smiled. And in that moment, Ethan knew the woman in front of him wasn't his wife. Not anymore. That night, David disappeared from his room. The door had been locked from the inside, the windows sealed. But the bed was empty, the sheets soaked in sweat and something darker. Ethan tore through the house, calling his name, shouting into the shadows. He found him in the basement, crouched near the old well beneath the red room, his hands submerged in the black water. "David!" Ethan cried, pulling him back. David didn't resist. He simply looked up and whispered, "She's almost here." Later, when Ethan washed David's hands, he found something carved into the skin. Symbols, etched with a blade, scabbed over but deep. Runes, ancient. And somehow, they glowed faintly beneath the bathroom light. Emily watched from the hallway, expression blank. When Ethan looked at her, she turned and walked away without a word. Days passed. Or hours. Time began to blur inside the house. Clocks stopped ticking. Phones refused to dial out. Even the sun seemed reluctant to rise over 112 Ocean Avenue. Emily grew colder. Her eyes darted constantly, as if seeing something behind the walls. She stopped responding to her name, answering only when called her vessel. Ethan wept when he found her praying in the red room, naked, her body painted in blood, swaying to a rhythm only she could hear. He tried to pull her away. She bit him, hard. That night, while Ethan showered, Emily came in quietly. She whispered his name. He turned, startled. She was fully clothed, calm. "I want to help you," she said. He barely had time to process the words before she lunged, shoving his head under the water. The shower turned scalding hot. Ethan thrashed, gasping for breath, trying to scream. "This is the only way," she muttered, eyes wide with tears. "They said it's the only way to free you." It took all his strength to push her off. He collapsed to the floor, coughing, bruised, staring up at her. She stood in silence for a moment, then walked out, dripping wet herself, murmuring the same chant over and over. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat by David's door with a bat in his hand, watching shadows move across the floor like spilled ink. He made a decision. He called Father Augustus, an old exorcist once known for facing down entities in South America, a man rumored to have driven demons out of caves, jungles, and mines. "I don't believe in legends," Augustus said on the phone. "But if what you're saying is true, I'll come." When the priest arrived, the temperature in the house dropped instantly. Breath became visible. The walls groaned. "Show me the boy," Augustus said. David sat quietly in the kitchen, sipping juice. He looked up and smiled, but Father Augustus stopped dead in his tracks. "The eyes," he said, "they're not his." The ritual began that night. Candles, holy water, Latin verses. David laughed through the prayers, his voice doubling in pitch and resonance. "Do you really think you can send her back?" he hissed. His body lifted off the floor, spinning slowly. Blood poured from his mouth. His eyes turned pitch black. Symbols crawled across his arms like living tattoos. The house shook. Emily arrived mid-ritual, screaming in tongues, lunging at the priest with a knife carved from bone. Ethan held her back, crying, pleading. "This isn't you," he shouted. She clawed his face, her mouth stretching open until it nearly split her cheeks. Father Augustus stood his ground. He raised the cross. "By the authority of heaven, I command you, leave this child." The lights exploded. A force invisible and violent slammed the priest into the wall. His body convulsed, his spine cracked, and then, without warning, he was lifted into the air and torn in half, his blood splattering across the walls in arcs. The house grew silent again. Emily dropped the knife. She screamed and collapsed. Ethan ran to the priest's remains, weeping, clutching the rosary that had fallen from the broken hand. David walked up behind him and placed a single finger on Ethan's shoulder. "Don't try again," he whispered. "She's awake now." And with that, he turned and walked into the darkness of the hallway, the floor lighting up with runes beneath his feet. That night, Ethan heard laughter beneath the floorboards, the sound of chains dragging, and above it all, the sound of Emily, chanting once more in the red room, her voice deeper than anything human. The possession was complete, but the nightmare had just begun. The next morning, Ethan awoke to a sound he hadn't heard in weeks. Music. Faint, nostalgic, drifting down from the attic. He froze. The family didn't keep a stereo up there. The attic was sealed months ago after strange thumping sounds and falling debris had driven them to avoid it. But now, as the music played, a slow, lilting piano melody, Ethan felt a pull in his chest. The tune was familiar, too familiar. It was the lullaby Emily used to hum to Sarah when she was a baby. Ethan climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking like the groan of the dying. The door to the attic was open, just a sliver. He pushed it wider. Inside, the music came from an old music box placed on a child-sized chair at the center of the room. Dust swirled in the cold air. Around the box were stuffed animals, torn, burned, and arranged in a circle as if watching the performance. Ethan reached for the music box. It snapped shut. Behind him, the attic door slammed closed. The air thickened. Something was here with him. Then he saw it, a pair of bare feet hanging in midair from the ceiling beam. He looked up slowly. It was Sarah. But not Sarah. Her skin was pale, her eyes gone, her mouth sewn shut with black thread. She swayed gently, like a broken doll. And yet, she lifted her hand, pointing not at Ethan, but at the corner behind him. He turned. There stood David, face blank, black veins pulsing beneath his skin. "She lives in the music now," he said flatly. "She's collecting us." Ethan backed toward the door, yanking it open and tumbling down the stairs. His body slammed into the wall at the bottom, knocking the breath out of him. But he didn't feel the pain. He was too busy staring at the message scrawled in blood on the hallway wall. "Let him go. Keep the mother." Emily had changed entirely. She no longer ate, no longer bathed, no longer responded to her name. Her hair hung in knots, her nails were blackened, and her eyes refused to blink. She sat in the red room for hours, fingers weaving invisible sigils into the air. Her chanting no longer made sound, her mouth moved, but the words came from the walls. Ethan tried to reach her. He begged, pleaded. "I need you," he whispered. "We can leave this house. Please come back." She turned to him slowly. "I died the day we moved in," she said with a twisted smile. She borrowed my voice to invite herself in. Then she stood, walked to the fireplace, and placed her hand into the flames. She did not scream. Ethan yanked her away, his hands blistering from the heat. But Emily's skin showed no burns, no mark. "She wants David," Emily said calmly. "And if you won't give him to her, she'll take you instead." Ethan called Mara again. But Mara was missing. Her house, when police arrived, was abandoned. Candles still burning. Her research scattered across the floor. In her journal, the final page read, "The boy isn't possessed. He's becoming." That night, Ethan heard scratching from inside the walls, like nails, like claws. He followed the noise to the living room, where Sarah sat curled into the couch, shaking. "She's in the mirror again," she whispered. "What mirror?" Sarah pointed. The hallway mirror had cracked. But in the shards, Ethan saw dozens of faces. Not just his own, not just his family. Faces of strangers, mouths wide in agony, eyes gouged out. And one face larger than the rest, Jody. "She's not in David anymore," Sarah said. "She is David now." Ethan tried to escape with the children. He packed bags, carried David and Sarah out into the snow. But the car wouldn't start. Not because of engine failure, because the engine had melted. Inside, the house groaned. Then the door opened. Emily stood there, but she was not Emily. Her skin was porcelain, her limbs too long. Her shadow moved separately from her body. She raised her hand, and the front lawn split. A chasm opened beneath Ethan's feet, forcing him to leap back. He watched as the ground cracked and hissed, something alive slithering just below the surface. "She said no one leaves," Emily said. Behind Ethan, David walked out calmly, barefoot in the snow. "She's coming now," he said. "And I'm ready." The final attempt came with the help of Father Benedict, a retired Vatican-trained exorcist who had studied the Amityville case for decades. He arrived wearing the robes of his order, carrying ancient relics and texts written in dead languages. "I can't save her," he told Ethan, "but I might be able to lock the gate she opened." That night, they sealed the Red Room. They placed relics in all corners, smeared the walls with holy oil, and began the invocation. Father Benedict chanted in Latin, switching to Aramaic when the air began to crackle. The walls bled. The floor steamed. The sigils carved into David's arms glowed bright red. Then the lights died. In the blackness, Jody spoke through all of them. "You thought this was about your family," her voice hissed. "But it's always been about the bloodline." Father Benedict cried out. He was lifted into the air, spun like a tornado, then hurled into the wall. Alive but broken, David collapsed, screaming. Emily's body floated off the floor, arms outstretched, her head snapping back and forth violently. "I am the mother now," she shrieked. Ethan, desperate, dragged Sarah out into the snow. Behind them, the house ignited, not with flame, but with light. Searing, supernatural light that poured from the windows like liquid holiness. And then silence. When Ethan turned back, the house was gone. Only the Red Room remained, floating above the crater like an open mouth. The house was no longer hiding. It breathed, pulsed. The walls seemed to expand and contract with every passing second, as if some vast, unseen heart beat beneath the floorboards. The very air had thickened, humming with frequencies only the damned could hear. And above all else, there was that ever-present smell, sulfur, rot, and ancient blood. Ethan Carter stood in the center of the hallway, barefoot and shaking, staring up at the ceiling where tendrils of blackness crept like veins under skin. He knew the house had changed, but what frightened him most was the knowledge that it had always been like this. It had simply been pretending. Now the facade was gone. It had revealed itself, and it wanted them all. Emily was gone. At least, the version of her that once painted sunrises on canvas. who sang softly while brushing Sarah's hair. That woman no longer existed. In her place was something hollow and ancient, wearing her skin like a costume. She no longer walked. She glided, her toes inches off the floor, her eyes completely white. David had grown quiet again. But his silence was different now. Before, it had been fear. Now it was calculation. His eyes studied the rooms like a general surveying a battlefield. He whispered to himself, words Ethan didn't understand. Yet they made his ears bleed. In the corner of the living room, Sarah sat with her back to the wall, drawing on the hardwood with her fingers. She wasn't using chalk. She was using ash, scooped from the fireplace with trembling hands. The red room never closed anymore. Its door hung open like a gaping maw, and from within came sounds no child should ever hear. Screams, growls, wet dragging noises. And underneath it all, laughter. Jody's laughter, high-pitched and joyous, like a child unwrapping a gift made of sinew and bone. That evening, as darkness fell, Ethan tried one last time to leave. He gathered Sarah and David, wrapped them in coats, and pulled them toward the front door. But as his hand reached the knob, it twisted on its own and turned to ash in his palm. The entire doorframe folded inward like paper and vanished, replaced by a writhing wall of black vines that whispered his name. There is no exit. He spun, grabbed David's hand, and recoiled. David's hand was cold, too cold, and it was changing. The veins had darkened, the nails turned jagged, like claws just beneath the skin. David looked up, eyes empty. She's almost ready, he said. Ethan staggered back. I don't know who you are anymore. David tilted his head. I'm the end. The portal opened at midnight. There was no ceremony, no thunder or lighting, just a sudden snap, as if reality itself cracked down the middle. From the red room, the walls split, not shattered, split like flesh being torn open. From within poured smoke, thick and oily, writhing with shapes that didn't make sense. Eyes that blinked without lids, teeth that floated without mouths, arms with too many joints. And at the center, Jody. She had arrived. Her true form was a perversion of anatomy. A child-sized body composed of twisting limbs, a face that changed every second. One moment Emily's, then Sarah's, then Ethan's own reflection. Her voice was every voice and none. When she spoke, the windows cracked. This house was a seed, she said, planted in cursed soil, fed with blood, watered with fear. She rose from the red room, floating above the floor, surrounded by the creatures that slithered after her. Some crawled on walls, others walked like men, but none bore the mark of life. This is not your world anymore. Emily walked forward, now fully consumed. Her face was blank, her mouth dripping a black substance that hissed upon contact with the floor. My body is hers, she said. I serve the will of the gate. And then Ethan felt it. A deep rumble beneath the foundation. The house was rising, not upward but outward, expanding, growing, transforming into something else. He ran upstairs, dragging Sarah behind him. Doors no longer led where they should. The bathroom opened to the attic. The kitchen led to a forest of screaming trees. Time unraveled, and Ethan saw fragments of his own past playing out in mirrors. His wedding, David's birth, Emily painting in sunlight. Only in every memory, Jody stood in the background, smiling. This had been planned, predestined. The Carter family were never victims of coincidence. They were sacrifices. David was alone now. He stood in the basement, surrounded by rot. The air shimmered, and from the shadows emerged a figure. A man in an old flannel shirt, holding a rifle. Ronald DeFeo Jr. But it wasn't really him. This version was skeletal, glowing faintly, eyes bleeding tar. You understand it now, don't you? DeFeo whispered. What I saw, what she showed me. David didn't answer. She told me they were monsters, that the only way to stop the pain was to erase the bloodline. And I tried. I really did. David stepped forward. She told me the same. You've got a chance, DeFeo said. To finish it, to end what I couldn't. From the shadows, A gun appeared, rusted, soaked in memory. David reached for it. Upstairs, Ethan screamed his name. David! Don't, please. But David's hands were steady. She says it'll all go away, he said. The fear, the pain, the voices. Jody appeared beside him. Just one trigger, she said, voice silky, and the world will be clean again. Ethan broke through the wall, bloodied and desperate. He tackled David, slamming the gun aside. They struggled, father and son. One possessed by grief, the other by hell itself. You don't have to do this, Ethan cried. You're stronger than her. She's already inside me, David shouted back. You don't understand. This hurts. I can't fight it. You're not alone. For a brief second, something in David's eyes shifted. The darkness flickered, and then Jody screamed, not in pain, in rage. You dare resist me? She surged forward, but Emily blocked her path. Suddenly lucid, tears streaming down her face. Take me, she whispered. Take me instead. And for a heartbeat, everything paused. Jody smiled. Emily collapsed into Ethan's arms. David fell back, unconscious, and the house began to burn. Not with fire, with light, pure, blinding, agonizing light. The red room collapsed inward. The creatures howled. Jody screamed, her form breaking apart, splintering into insects, bones, and dust. Ethan grabbed both children and ran. Behind him, the floor crumbled. The walls screamed. The very air bled. They reached the porch. And then the house imploded. Everything vanished in a pulse of silence. Where once stood a gateway to hell was now only snow. Ethan never spoke of what happened. David recovered. Sarah forgot, or pretended to. Emily remained in a coma, breathing but never waking. But sometimes, in the hospital room, when Ethan sat beside her bed, he swore he heard her whisper, "She's not gone. She's waiting." There was no longer a difference between night and day inside the house. Time had folded. The windows, where sunlight once strained to enter, now only reflected darkness. There was no wind, no seasons, no sound of the outside world. Only the humming walls, the creaking floors, and the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the house. It was alive, and it had no intention of letting them leave. Ethan Carter stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring down the hallway that used to lead to the kitchen. Now it stretched impossibly long, lined with doors that hadn't existed before. Each one throbbed faintly, as if breathing. Behind him, Sarah clung to his coat, her tiny fingers trembling. She hadn't spoken in hours. The house had changed again. At first, it was subtle. Furniture shifted. Hallways turned. Mirrors showed rooms they weren't supposed to. But now it was blatant. The house had sealed itself shut. Windows were bricked over. Doors looped into the same rooms. The front door opened to the attic. The bathroom led to a hallway of whispers. They were trapped. And worse, something hunted them from within. Ethan had lost track of David 3 hours ago. Or was it 3 days? Time made no sense anymore. He had gone looking for water in what used to be the laundry room. Instead, he found a staircase spiraling downward, far deeper than the basement had ever gone. When he emerged, the house was different. Sarah was older. Emily was gone. Or rather, what had taken her place was no longer pretending to be human. He saw her in flashes. At the end of hallways, crouched on the ceiling, her head twisting unnaturally. She whispered to the walls and they whispered back. "Bring me the boy," she said. "Bring me the key." David ran through an endless hallway, chased by things with faces he recognized. His mother, his father, his younger self. But they were twisted, mangled, screaming. "You let us die," one shouted. "You deserve to burn," cried another. He tried to close his eyes, but the visions were inside his skull, projected on the walls of his own mind. This was Jody's realm now. Every turn he took, the house reshaped itself. Sometimes he ran through the school hallway where he had been bullied as a child. Other times he stood in the backyard, watching his dog die again and again, always out of reach. Then there was the bathroom, blood-stained, filled with mirrors that screamed instead of reflected. David fell to his knees. "I didn't ask for this," he whispered. Jody laughed from the shadows. "You were born for this," she said. "You carry the mark. The others were just preparation." He felt her inside his head, twisting memories, rewriting truth, making him doubt what was real. "You killed them," she whispered. "Don't you remember?" "No. You will." Ethan and Sarah wandered through corridors that looped infinitely. They marked doors with blood from Ethan's scraped knuckles, but still ended up in the same room. A child's bedroom, walls covered in crayon drawings of fire, monsters, and broken hearts. Each time they entered, the drawings had changed. One now showed Ethan holding a knife, standing over Emily's body. Another showed Sarah, mouth sewn shut, trapped inside a mirror. He had to get her out, but the house wouldn't let go. The walls pulsed. The ceiling bled. A television turned on without power, showing home videos they never filmed. In one, Ethan watched himself scream at David. In another, he saw Emily weep while holding a baby that didn't exist. Regret was currency here, and the house was rich. David found himself in the Red Room. Only now it stretched into a cathedral of bone and fire. At the center stood a massive altar, pulsing like a living heart. Emily stood beside it, naked, her body covered in black script. Her eyes glowed with a pale red light. "You're almost ready," she said. David didn't move. "Why?" he whispered. "To finish what was started," she answered. "To open the gate. Fully. Forever." From the shadows, Jody appeared, no longer hiding behind a child's form. She was enormous, serpentine, draped in smoke and sinew. Her arms reached the ceiling. Her face had no eyes, only a mouth that stretched from ear to ear. "A blood sacrifice," she hissed. "That is the price. Your family for the world. The gate opens with your hand." She handed him the knife, pulsed with heat. David trembled. "They love me," he said. "They'd die for me." "Yes," Jody replied. "And now they must." Ethan and Sarah reached the main hallway again. But this time it was different. David stood at the far end, his back turned, holding something behind him. "David!" Ethan called out. He turned slowly. His face was blank. "Empty." She said, "It's the only way." "David, listen to me." She promised peace. She promised no more pain. Ethan stepped forward, arms out. "She lies." David raised the knife. "She said you'd say that." Then Emily dropped from the ceiling like a spider, tackling Ethan. She screamed in languages no man should speak, her mouth splitting down the center, revealing endless teeth. "He's mine." Ethan struggled. Sarah screamed. David stood frozen. The house began to shake. Walls cracked. Fire burst from sockets. The floor turned to flesh. Then David screamed and threw the knife into the fire. "I choose me," Jody shrieked, a sound that shattered every mirror in the house. Emily collapsed. The portal cracked. The house groaned. And then everything went dark. Ethan woke up outside. Snow fell gently. The house was gone. Sarah slept in his lap. David sat beside him, staring at the horizon. "She's not dead," he whispered. Ethan nodded. "But she's locked. For now." They never spoke of it again. But sometimes, when David dreams, he still sees the Red Room. And the knife, still burning, still waiting. The moon rose red, not just tinged with copper, but bleeding across the sky like an open wound in the heavens. The night air thickened with something ancient, something that pulsed through the trees, through the clouds, and most of all through the house. 112 Ocean Avenue no longer resembled a home. Its windows glowed with flickering light, not from candles or electricity, but from within, like a furnace just beneath the walls. The wood groaned, the pipes screamed, and the foundation seemed to shift, exhaling deep, guttural breaths that vibrated through the soil. The blood moon had come, and with it the house awakened. David Carter stood in the center of the upstairs hallway, sweat slick on his skin despite the cold. His breath came in gasps, and though the house was deathly silent, He could hear it, feel it, throbbing like a beast roused from slumber. He was holding the photograph again. One he hadn't known existed until it fell from the attic wall. The Lutz family, smiling, together. But on the back, a single message had been scrawled in red ink. The house does not forgive. It remembers. That night, as the moon climbed higher, David found the journal. It was hidden behind the fireplace bricks, wrapped in plastic, pages yellowed and fragile. The leather cover bore a name burned deep into it, George Lutz. He opened it slowly, and the words inside peeled open a truth more terrifying than any ghost. December 16th, 1975. The house watches. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean literally. The walls have eyes. I feel them at night, behind mirrors, inside vents. Kathy says I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. But when I dream, I see things I never lived. Rituals, sacrifices, blood painted on floors. There's something in the basement. Something old. December 19th, 1975. I followed the sound again. That awful chanting. It always leads to the red room. It was supposed to be a storage closet. But it's more than that. It's warm. The walls pulse. Last night, I swear I saw it breathing. I opened the trapdoor beneath the carpet. There's a tunnel. Stone walls. Markings I don't understand. December 21st, 1975. Started with the dog. Then the kids. They're not acting right. Kathy stood over me while I slept, whispering in a language that made my nose bleed. The mirrors show faces that aren't ours. And there's something calling from the basement. She says her name is Jody. December 24th, 1975. We have to leave. This isn't a haunting. It's a curse. The land itself was stolen, taken from the Montaukett people. There were sacred grounds here. A burial site desecrated by colonists. Blood was spilled. Rituals were performed. Something was opened. It never closed. David stopped reading. His hands trembled. He looked at the fire. It flickered unnaturally, casting shadows that stretched and twisted, whispering fragments of prayers and screams. The journal wasn't just a record, it was a warning. And a map. In the basement, beneath layers of rotted carpet and time-stained wood, David found the trapdoor. It was exactly as George described, carved with symbols, surrounded by black ash, and warm to the touch. He hesitated, then pulled it open. The air below rushed upward, hot and wet, like breath from an open mouth. He climbed down. The tunnel stretched far beneath the house. Torches flickered to life as he passed, each one igniting with a hiss as if recognizing him. The walls were stone, etched with scenes of torment, figures bound, burned, buried alive. The deeper he went, the louder the heartbeat became. At the end, he found it. The original altar. A slab of obsidian surrounded by bones and candles, with a bowl resting at the center. Still wet with dark red fluid, though no one had been there in decades. Above it, a carving. Blood opens. Blood seals. He turned to leave and froze. Standing behind him was Emily. But not Emily. Her skin was porcelain, her eyes voids, and her smile unnatural. "You found it," she said sweetly. "The source." "I know what this place is," David said. "And I know what has to be done." Her smile widened. "Then you know what it costs." He nodded. "A life." The red room pulsed with heat. Ethan and Sarah waited inside, huddled, surrounded by salt and symbols etched into the wood. But the symbols no longer protected. The house had adapted. The red room no longer waited to be entered. It reached out. Flames danced from the walls. The mirror in the corner showed not their reflections, but their deaths. Suddenly, the door burst open. David entered, eyes wild, journal in hand. "I found it," he said. "The way to end it." Ethan stood. "Where have you been?" "I don't have time to explain. Just listen. This curse, it started before the DeFeos, before the Lutzes. This land, it was sacred, then defiled. The house was built as a gate. The red room is the key. To what? To hell." He dropped the journal at Ethan's feet. "And to seal it, I have to destroy it." "How?" David looked down. With blood. Ethan's eyes widened. No. It's the only way. A sacrifice, willing. Given, not taken. The house was fed by hatred, by murder. But it can be sealed with love. That's what the Lutzes didn't know. David. I choose this. I have to. Then, without warning, the walls screamed. Jody arrived. She descended like a shadow swallowing light. Her form filled the room. Black tendrils of smoke and fire. 1,000 mouths, each whispering different truths. You think love can undo what's been done? She hissed. You think blood can seal the gate when I have opened it? She struck the floor, and the house shook. Mirrors shattered. Sarah screamed. Emily stepped forward, body convulsing. David raised the dagger. Jody laughed. You are mine. David didn't flinch. I never was. And then he turned the dagger, not toward her, but to his own heart. Ethan lunged. No! But it was too late. Blood spilled, and the house screamed. The ritual completed. The fire turned white. The red room imploded, folding in on itself like crushed paper. Jody's form tore apart, scattered into ash and wind. Emily collapsed, her body smoking. Ethan caught her. David fell to his knees. But the house was quiet. For the first time in centuries. It was done. The gate was sealed. When Ethan carried David's body out into the cold, the blood moon faded. The sky returned to black. Snow fell softly. The house was gone. Only scorched earth remained. And in David's journal, a single final entry appeared, written in his own blood. A life for peace. Let it be enough. The wind no longer blew outside the house. The snow had stopped falling. The clouds above were painted a permanent blood-orange hue, as though time had frozen during the dying gasp of the blood moon. Inside, the walls pulsed like living muscle, and the house groaned as if bracing for a birth or a death. David Carter stood alone in the main hallway of 112 Ocean Avenue. His clothes were soaked in sweat, soot, and blood, some his own, some not. The air was so thick it filled his lungs like smoke. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He knew what had to be done. All around him, the house had begun to shift. Doorways folded in on themselves. Staircases turned to bone. Floors rippled beneath his feet, and walls wept with molten pitch. The house was dying, and it was fighting back. From the far end of the corridor, a shriek echoed, a sound layered with 1,000 screams. It was her, Jody. Not the apparition of a little girl anymore, but her true form. A monstrous force of entropy and hunger, clothed in black fire, with a face that changed with every blink. Sometimes it was Emily. Sometimes it was Ethan. Sometimes it was David's own reflection, screaming at him to run. But he didn't. He stepped forward. The floor beneath him cracked, exposing the veins of the house. Pulsating roots, sinew, and something darker. He could feel the spirits moving. Hundreds, no thousands, trapped in the walls, in the beams, in the nails. They cried out for mercy, for vengeance, for freedom. Every step he took was like walking on graves. In the ruined dining room, the air shimmered. Spirits began to appear, each one flickering into view like faded memories. Some dressed in colonial clothing, others in 19th century coats. A family of 6 hovered in the corner, the DeFeos, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. They didn't attack. They only watched. David turned to face them. I'm going to end this, he said. I swear it. The house didn't like that. From the ceiling, a burst of black bile exploded, coating the chandelier and turning it into a writhing nest of serpents. A wall collapsed behind him, revealing the red room, its door yawning wide like the throat of a beast. Then Jody spoke. You think you're the first to try? She hissed. You're all the same, righteous, willing, but not enough. David stood his ground. You need me, he said. I'm the last key. Jody's voice stretched through the walls. And you'll give yourself freely? Just like that? No, he said. Not freely. Then he turned, running toward the stairs where Ethan lay unconscious, his face covered in soot, one leg pinned beneath a fallen beam. Fire licked the edges of the ceiling above him. Emily knelt beside him, rocking back and forth, eyes wide, muttering. As David reached them, the walls screamed. The house was collapsing. "Ethan," David called, kneeling. "You have to get up." Ethan groaned, slowly opening his eyes. "David?" David turned to Emily, and for a moment, for the first time in days, she was herself again. Her eyes were glassy, terrified, but clear. "David," she whispered. "She's inside me. I can feel her burning." "I know. You have to stop her," she begged. "Take Ethan. Get out." David looked at her. He saw everything: his mother, broken but strong, a survivor, a prisoner, a soul trapped in the deepest part of a ruined home. "I can't leave," David said. "But you can." Emily grabbed his hand. "Save him," she whispered. "If you save him, maybe I'm still in there." He nodded, and in that instant the house roared. Jody screamed. The flames burst into unnatural blue fire, swallowing furniture whole. The walls cracked. From beneath the red room, the earth rumbled. David lifted Ethan and dragged him down the hall, Emily following behind. But the house wasn't going to let them go easily. It sealed the exits. Every door disappeared. The windows turned to eyes. And from the cracks in the floor, creatures emerged, born of shadow and bone. They crawled on all fours, faceless, snapping at the air. David knew there was only one way out. He dropped Ethan beside the last remaining wall. "You have to run," he said. "When I say now, you run. Don't stop." "David, no," Ethan coughed. "You're not doing this alone." "Yes, I am." Then David turned, sprinting into the red room. The moment he stepped inside, it transformed. No longer a room, a chasm, a world beneath the world. Here, fire didn't burn, it consumed souls. The ground was cracked obsidian. Bones littered the edges like discarded prayers. At the center, Jody waited. Her full form, a leviathan of teeth, wings, and eyes. A thing birthed from humanity's worst sins. "I knew you'd come," she hissed. David stood at the edge of the abyss, clutching the knife from the ritual, the journal pages sewn into his jacket. "This ends now," he said. Jody laughed. "Then come and get me." The battle wasn't fought with fists but with memory. Jody showed him visions, his worst fears, his own hands around Sarah's throat, his father bleeding in the bathtub, Emily screaming for help. 1,000 ways he failed them, but he didn't flinch. "They're not real," he whispered. "They are you." "No," David said, stepping forward. "I choose who I am." He plunged the blade into the center of the altar. The ground split open. The house shrieked, and Jody lunged. But David wrapped his arms around her form, hugged the monster to him, and leapt into the abyss. The house exploded. Not outward, inward. It folded in on itself, dragging fire, wood, memories, spirits, and pain into a single collapsing point of light. Emily screamed. Ethan pulled her through the hallway, toward a sliver of sky where the wall had fallen. They dove. The world turned white. When Ethan awoke, he was in the snow. The house was gone. The lot was empty, blackened. Emily lay beside him, unconscious. And David, gone. But in the distance, a single sound echoed. Not a scream, not a sob, a laugh. Small, soft, childlike. And then silence. The snow had melted. Spring arrived not with fanfare, but with soft wind and pale skies. The birds returned to the trees. Grass fought through the frostbitten earth. And in the quiet corner of a small town, life dared to start again. The house was gone. At least the old one was. 112 Ocean Avenue no longer bore the weight of its past. The foundation had been torn down, the lot cleared. Concrete poured fresh into the ground. The trees trimmed. The soil treated. A new house stood there now, modern, minimal, white siding, dark shutters. Crisp lines. No attic. A house reborn. But not everyone believed the curse had ended. Ethan Carter walked every morning. Down the road, past the river, across the bridge, and back. The same loop, the same pace. He rarely spoke. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes he walked barefoot. Every day he stopped at the vacant lot beside the rebuilt house and stared for 5 minutes. Never more, never less. People thought it was grief, but it was something else. He was listening, because she still spoke to him. The girl in white. Emily had changed. She kept her hair short now. She didn't paint anymore. Her hands trembled too often. Sometimes she spoke to herself in her sleep, whispering David's name. Other nights she stood in the kitchen until morning, watching the toaster, as if waiting for something to rise. The doctors called it trauma. The priests called it grace. But Emily knew better. She had been touched, branded. A sliver of the house still lived inside her. She'd buried her son without a body, a grave with no weight. The headstone simply read David Carter, 2005 to 2025, the light in our darkness. But she still saw him, in dreams, in corners, in reflections, and sometimes, when she dared to look at the moon, she swore it bled again. Ethan didn't talk about that night. Not to Emily, not to Sarah, not even to himself. But the silence grew teeth. It gnawed at his mind. He took sleeping pills and drank coffee together. He started whispering to the wind. And once, in the middle of the night, Emily found him in the backyard, building something out of rocks and feathers. She asked what it was. He answered, "A door." She didn't press further, because she'd seen the girl too. The girl in white returned slowly. At first, just a glimpse, standing by the edge of the road, head tilted, hair tangled. Then in the window across the street. Then in reflections, in water, in metal, in glass. She never spoke. She simply watched. Until one day, Ethan turned to her and said, "Why are you still here?" And she replied, in a voice only he heard, "Because it's not over." 6 months after the collapse, a new family arrived. The Parkers. Mother, father, 2 boys. They were from upstate. They wanted a fresh start. They loved the school district. They couldn't believe the price. The realtor smiled too much. The papers were signed. The furniture arrived. The door unlocked with a soft click. No one warned them. No one dared. The town had grown tired of the past. Tired of the stories. Tired of the fear. They believed forgetting was the same as cleansing. The new house looked perfect. Open floor plan. Sunlight. Hardwood floors. No red room. But it began again slowly. A creak where no one stepped. The dog barking at the basement. The faucet turning on at 3:03 a.m. And then, the dream. Mrs. Parker woke up screaming. She told her husband about a little girl in white who whispered to her about a room that wasn't on the blueprints. He told her it was just stress. Until their youngest son drew a picture the next morning. A door under the floorboards, with red light behind it. Ethan stood at the edge of their driveway. The house was alive again. He could feel it in his bones. In his dreams, David stood in the garden, barefoot, pointing at the window. He never spoke, but Ethan understood. The cycle was beginning again. And this time it would be worse, because something had changed. Jody wasn't just hiding. She was waiting. Late one evening, Emily looked out the window while washing dishes. The new family's lights were on. The boys played in the living room. The parents sat at the table. And upstairs, just behind the curtain, a shadow moved, stood still, watching. Not a person, not a memory, something older, turned, and smiled. Emily dropped the glass. Ethan no longer slept indoors. He built a tent in the backyard. Said the walls were too loud. Said the girl in white visited every night now. Said she kept asking one question. "Will you let them burn too?" He never answered. But he started digging. And one day he found the stone again. The altar. The one that should have been buried with the house. He ran his fingers over the old carving. The one that had never stopped glowing. Blood opens. Blood seals. And in the final moment, as thunder rolled and wind screamed across Ocean Avenue once more, upstairs in the new house, at the center window, framed by black curtains, a figure stood. Not a child. Not a woman. Something between. eyes like open wounds, smile like shattered porcelain. And the shadow stretched across the wall behind her, growing, reaching, crawling down the hallway. Because Jody never truly left. She only waited for the house to breathe again. The grass had grown over the lot again. Where once stood a cursed house, where blood-stained walls and screams echoed through generations. Now there was only a field. Wildflowers bloomed where the red room once breathed. Children rode their bikes past without fear. The wind returned. The birds sang again. To the world it was over, buried. But in Amityville, nothing stays buried for long. Ethan Carter sat beneath a tree at the far end of the property, notebook in hand, writing in long, slanted lines. He didn't look at the rebuilt house anymore. He didn't need to. He could feel it from across the street. It breathed in the soil, hummed in the roots. Even the wind curved around it. Emily no longer asked him what he wrote. She tried in the beginning, but when he handed her the page, the ink bled through her fingers and disappeared. Now she painted again, only in black and white. Always the same room. Always the same girl. Always the same door. Sarah, too, was different. She stopped drawing in school. She refused to use the color red. And every night, at exactly 2:59 a.m., she would wake up and whisper toward her closet. Not yet. They never told the new family the truth. The Parkers stayed. The father grew thin. The mother smiled too much. The older boy stopped speaking. The youngest had an imaginary friend named Jody. They thought it was just trauma. They didn't know the signs. Didn't see the water stains that moved on the ceiling. Didn't question why the mirrors fogged from the outside. Didn't notice the basement was always 3 degrees warmer. Until the youngest drew a picture of David, standing in the garden, holding a knife. Ethan felt it begin again. The dream came back. The sound of whispering beneath the floorboards. The scent of burning feathers. The click of a door that didn't exist opening in the walls. He tried to warn the town. They laughed. They patted his shoulder. They called it grief. Even Emily begged him to stop. But every night Ethan wrote more. The journal grew thicker. Until one night, Sarah stood beside his bed and whispered, "She's almost strong enough again." That spring, the rain came early. It soaked the earth. It sank into the foundation. And one night, the Parker family heard something shift beneath the house. A hollow knock. Then another. Then scratching. The youngest began sleepwalking. He walked to the hallway wall, placed his hand on the paint and said, "She's underneath." Emily dropped her paintbrush mid-stroke. Her canvas tore itself. Black lines crawled across the walls of her studio. And in the mirror David appeared. Not alive. Not dead. Frozen. Trapped. "Mom," he said. "She wants another." Ethan buried the journal in the woods behind their house. He salted the ground. He prayed. But the next morning it was on his desk. Open. New writing inside. Writing he didn't remember. Just one phrase over and over. Blood opens. Blood opens. Blood opens. And on the anniversary, exactly 1 year from the night the house collapsed, a red moon rose. It wasn't scheduled. No eclipse predicted. No scientists warned of its coming. But it rose just the same. And in the upstairs window of the rebuilt home, the curtain shifted. And the girl in white stepped forward. But this time, she wasn't alone. David stood beside her. And behind them, a door. And behind the door, a light, red, pulsing, hungry. The legacy wasn't over. It was just beginning again.